He invited his assistant just to humiliate her, but when she arrived, no one could stop staring. The aroma of freshly ground coffee filled the executive office on the 35th floor when Alexander Sterling Blackwood reached for the gold-embossed envelope resting on his Italian mahogany desk. His fingers, adorned with a family signet ring dating back to the 18th century, brushed the parchment paper with the elegance of someone who had never known denial. "Annual Metropolitan Business Gala," he read aloud, a cruel smile forming on his perfectly sculpted lips. It was the most exclusive event of the year, where the titans of American industry displayed not only their economic power, but also their most prized conquests, the most beautiful women on the continent. Alexander leaned back in his black leather chair and gazed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of Manhattan. His blue eyes, cold as Arctic ice, drifted toward the small, hunched figure, quietly organizing files in the opposite corner of the office. Isabella Rose Sinclair, his executive assistant for the past 3 years. The invisible woman who prepared his coffee exactly as he liked it, who anticipated his needs before he expressed them, and who had never lifted her gaze long enough to hold his for more than 2 seconds. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. To Alexander, Isabella was simply part of the office furniture, a presence as common and predictable as the bamboo plant by the window or the Swiss watch that marked the hours with millimetric precision. She always wore the same type of clothing, beige or gray blouses, skirts that reached her knees, and those enormous glasses that seemed to swallow half her face. But that afternoon, as he contemplated the golden invitation, a perverse idea began to take shape in his brilliant and calculating mind. What would happen if he brought the most insignificant woman in all of Manhattan to the most glamorous event of the year? The mere thought provoked a sinister laugh. "Sinclair," he called without bothering to turn his head. Isabella trembled slightly, as she always did when he pronounced her surname with that authoritative voice he had perfected since college. She left the documents on the filing cabinet and approached his desk with small, measured steps, keeping her gaze fixed on the marble floor. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood," she responded with that soft voice that barely rose above a whisper. Alexander turned his chair to face her, studying every detail of her appearance with the meticulousness of a scientist observing an uninteresting species. The enormous glasses, the chestnut hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to hurt, the wrinkled blouse that had seen better days. "Do you have plans for Saturday night?" he asked, though the answer seemed obvious to him. What plans could a woman like her have? Probably reading some boring book or watching series in the solitude of her small apartment. Isabella blinked several times behind her glasses, clearly confused by the unexpected question. In 3 years of work, Alexander had never shown the slightest interest in her personal life. "No, sir, I don't have any particular plans," she responded, nervously adjusting her glasses. "Perfect." Alexander stood up and walked to the window, turning his back while speaking. "I'm inviting you to the Metropolitan Business Gala. I need a companion, and you are available." The silence that followed was so dense it could have been cut with a knife. Alexander counted mentally to 10 before turning to observe Isabella's reaction. What he saw surprised him slightly. Instead of the overwhelming gratitude he expected, he found an expression of deep reflection in her brown eyes. "May I ask why you chose me, sir?" Isabella asked after a moment, and for the first time in 3 years, her voice sounded firm and clear. The question caught him off guard. Was the little office mouse questioning his motivations? A spark of irritation ignited in his chest. "Does the opportunity seem insufficient to you?" he countered coldly. "It's the most exclusive event of the year. Any woman would be desperate to attend." Isabella studied him for a long moment, and Alexander had the strange sensation that she saw something he preferred to keep hidden. Finally she nodded slowly. "I accept your invitation, Mr. Blackwood." "Thank you." What Alexander couldn't imagine was that at that precise moment, Isabella Rose Sinclair was making the most important decision of her life. For 3 years she had lived in the shadows, had allowed herself to be treated as invisible, had buried every vestige of the woman she used to be. But something in the cruel way he had formulated the invitation had given her the clarity she needed. It was time to remind the world who she really was. That night, in her modest apartment in Greenwich Village, Isabella sat before her vanity mirror and slowly removed her glasses. Her reflection returned a gaze she hadn't seen in years, the almond-shaped eyes she had inherited from her mother, Mercedes Sinclair, the most acclaimed contemporary dancer in New York in the 90s. With trembling hands, she opened the bottom drawer of her dresser and extracted a black velvet box that had remained closed for almost a decade. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, she found the photographs she kept like forbidden treasures. Mercedes Sinclair on the stage of Lincoln Center, her body moving with a grace that defied gravity, her eyes burning with a passion that transcended music. "Mom," whispered Isabella, caressing the golden edge of one of the photographs, "it's time to honor your memory." The next day, Isabella made a call she hadn't made in 5 years. At the third ring, a familiar voice with a slight accent answered on the other end of the line. "Isabella."
"My God.
"Is it really you?" exclaimed Sophia Rose Mendez, and the relief in her voice was palpable. "Hello, Sophia. I need your help. Anything, cousin. Anything." 3 days later, Sophia arrived in Manhattan, with 2 suitcases full of secrets from Italian haute couture, and an iron determination.
So,
Isabella's transformation would not be just physical, it would be a resurrection.
are you sure about this?"
asked Sophia while examining Isabella's Spartan wardrobe. "Once you cross this line, you can't go back. He'll see who you really are, and that will change everything." Isabella looked at herself in the full-length mirror that Sophia had brought. Without the glasses, without the tight bun, without the oversized clothes she had used as armor for years, she could see the contours of the woman she had buried. "I'm tired of hiding," she responded with a conviction that surprised even herself. "I'm tired of being invisible." Have you ever had to hide who you really are to protect yourself? How do you think it feels to have to live in the shadows? The following 4 days were a complete metamorphosis. Sophia not only transformed Isabella's appearance, she taught her to walk again, to hold gazes, to occupy the space she deserved. She reminded her that she carried in her veins the blood of a woman who had conquered the most important stages of America. "Your mother didn't hide from anyone," Sophia would say while they practiced postures in front of the mirror. Mercedes Sinclair entered a room and the entire world stopped to look at her. "That power is in you, Isabella. It's always been there." The night of the gala, Alexander adjusted his Italian silk tie in front of the mirror of his penthouse on the Upper East Side. He had chosen his most expensive tuxedo, the one he had custom-made on Savile Row the previous year. He felt like a conqueror about to claim enemy territory. The plan was perfect in its simplicity. He would arrive at the Plaza Hotel with the most common and boring woman in Manhattan. The photographer's flashes would capture the image of the most unequal couple at the event. By the next morning, all the business elite would be talking about Alexander Blackwood's extravagant eccentricity, and he would have demonstrated once again that he could afford any whim, however absurd. "Ingenious," he murmured to himself as he headed toward the Aston Martin waiting in the garage. 20 minutes later, he stopped in front of the building where Isabella lived. Greenwich Village seemed even more depressing than he had imagined. Aged buildings, narrow streets, common people walking hurriedly. It was the perfect setting to pick up his prop companion. Alexander remained in the car, waiting to see the familiar and diminutive figure of his assistant appear. He consulted his Rolex. 8 o'clock sharp. Isabella was always punctual. That's when he saw her. At first, his brain refused to process what his eyes were registering. A woman was emerging from the building's entrance, but it couldn't be Isabella. This woman moved with a fluid grace reminiscent of classical dancers. Her chestnut hair, freed from its usual prison, fell in soft waves over her shoulders. The dress she wore was a masterpiece of haute couture, a design that fused Italian elegance with contemporary dance elements, embroidered with golden threads that captured the streetlight like stars trapped in velvet. But it was her eyes that stopped Alexander's world. Without the gigantic glasses that had hidden them for years, Isabella's eyes shone with an intensity that took his breath away. They were deep, expressive, the color of dark honey, and they looked at him with a confidence he had never seen in her. "Mr. Blackwood?" asked Isabella, approaching the car with confident steps. Her voice had changed too. It was still soft, but now had a musical quality he had never noticed. Alexander remained motionless for several seconds, unable to formulate a response. The transformation was so complete, so impossible, that for a moment he wondered if he hadn't made a case of mistaken identity. Is it you?" he managed to articulate finally, getting out of the car to open her door. "It's me," responded Isabella with a smile that contained secrets he was just beginning to suspect. "Shall we go?" Throughout the journey to the Plaza Hotel, Alexander fought against a growing sensation of bewilderment. His perfect plan was crumbling before it began. Instead of arriving with a companion who would provoke pity or condescending laughter, he was driving toward the most important event of the year with a woman who was dazzling. "Where did you get that dress?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "My cousin is a designer," responded Isabella, looking out the window at the lights of Manhattan stretching before them. "Sophia always told me I should dress better for work, but I never listened to her." "Your cousin? Do I know her?" For the first time in the conversation, Isabella turned completely toward him, and Alexander felt the full impact of her transformed gaze. "There are many things you don't know about me, Mr. Blackwood," she said with an enigmatic smile. "Tonight perhaps you'll discover some of them." When they arrived at the Plaza Hotel, the red carpet extended like a scarlet river from the main entrance to the sidewalk, flanked by photographers and journalists specialized in high society life. Alexander had walked that carpet dozens of times, always alone, always conscious of the envious gazes of those who wished to be in his position. But that night, when the valet opened the door of the Aston Martin and Isabella emerged from the vehicle with a grace that seemed choreographed, something extraordinary happened. The constant murmur of conversations gradually faded until it became absolute silence. The camera flashes began firing with frantic intensity, but they weren't directed toward Alexander. All the lenses, all the gazes, all the attention was completely focused on the woman walking beside him with the confidence of a queen. "Who is she?" Alexander heard someone whisper. "I've never seen her before." Another voice responded. "She's absolutely stunning. Must be a foreign actress. Has to be a model." Alexander felt a strange mixture of pride and panic. This wasn't the result he had planned. He was supposed to be the center of attention, the object of admiration and envy. But as they advanced down the red carpet, he realized he had simply become the fortunate companion of the most fascinating woman at the event. Inside the hotel's grand ballroom, America's business elite had gathered in all their splendor. Multi-millionaire entrepreneurs conversed with ministers and aristocrats, while the most beautiful women in the country wore dresses that cost more than most citizens' annual salary. Patrick Andrew Morrison, Alexander's main business rival, was the first to approach. Tall, distinguished, with perfectly combed silver hair, Patrick had built a technological empire that competed directly with Blackwood Industries. "Alexander," he greeted with a smile that didn't reach his gray eyes. "What a surprise to see you here with a companion. You usually prefer solitude." But when Patrick directed his attention toward Isabella, his expression changed completely. The sardonic smile transformed into one of genuine admiration. "Allow me to introduce," began Alexander, but he realized he didn't know how to introduce Isabella, as his assistant, as his companion. The situation had completely escaped his control. "Isabella Rose Sinclair," she introduced herself, extending her hand toward Patrick with natural elegance. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Morrison. I've followed your company's development for years. Your approach to applied artificial intelligence is truly innovative." Patrick took her hand and kissed it softly, clearly impressed not only by her beauty, but by her business knowledge. "The pleasure is entirely mine, Miss Sinclair. May I ask what you do?" Isabella smiled, and Alexander noticed a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Currently I work in business strategy development," she responded diplomatically. "But I'm considering new opportunities." During the next hour, Alexander watched with growing amazement as Isabella navigated the event with an ease that rivaled any experienced socialite. She conversed fluently about technology, global economics, art, and politics. She spoke Italian with the ambassador's wife, French with the director of a European banking conglomerate, and German with a businesswoman who had flown from Berlin specifically for the event. How is it possible I knew nothing about this? Alexander wondered as he watched her from a distance. For 3 years, Isabella had been by his side day after day, and he had assumed he knew her completely. But the woman before him was a complete mystery. It was during dinner when the moment occurred that would change everything forever. The event organizer took the stage and announced that, following gala tradition, there would be a special artistic presentation. This year, they had decided to honor American cultural heritage with a celebration of contemporary dance. Unfortunately, continued the organizer, our main artist has had to cancel due to a family emergency. If there's someone in the audience who could honor us with a demonstration of this beautiful art. A murmur of disappointment ran through the ballroom. Contemporary dance was one of the most appreciated traditions in American culture, and many guests had anticipated the presentation. Alexander noticed that Isabella had become tense. Her hands, which had been relaxed on the table, now gripped the linen napkin with such force that her knuckles had turned white. "Are you all right?" he asked in a low voice. Isabella looked at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. For a moment, he saw something vulnerable in her eyes, something that reminded him of the shy woman he thought he knew. "My mother was a contemporary dancer," she murmured, so quietly that he had to lean in to hear her. "Was? Mercedes Sinclair. She died when I was 18. The name hit Alexander like lightning. Mercedes Sinclair had been a legend, a dancer from humble beginnings, who had conquered the most prestigious stages in America with her unique passion and talent. She had died in a car accident that had shocked the dance world. "You are," began Alexander, but couldn't finish the sentence. "Her daughter," completed Isabella. "The daughter who decided to hide from the world because she couldn't bear the comparisons." Without warning, Isabella stood up. The movement was so fluid and decisive that several people at nearby tables turned to look at her. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, with a voice that now carried an echo of steel, "tonight I didn't come here as your assistant. I came as the woman I've been burying for years, and that woman has something to say." Before Alexander could respond, Isabella headed toward the stage. Each step she took resonated with a determination that electrified the atmosphere. When she climbed onto the stage and took the microphone, the silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. "Good evening," she began, and her voice amplified clearly throughout the space. "My name is Isabella Rose Sinclair, and I am the daughter of Mercedes Sinclair." A murmur of recognition ran through the audience. Many of those present remembered the legendary dancer. "For years I hid from my heritage," continued Isabella. "I thought that if I made myself invisible, if I denied who I was, the pain of her loss would disappear. But tonight I've understood that honoring her memory doesn't mean living in her shadow, it means shining with my own light." Isabella signaled to the DJ, who began playing a contemporary piece. The first measures filled the ballroom with their passionate melancholy. "This is for you, Mom," whispered Isabella, though the microphone caught her words and carried them to every corner of the ballroom. What happened next transcended any definition of beauty that Alexander had ever known. Isabella began to move, and her body transformed into pure poetry. Every gesture, every movement of her arms, every step across the stage floor told a story of pain, loss, rebirth, and triumph. There was no traditional costume, no props, no live orchestra accompaniment, just a woman and her naked soul, expressing herself through an art she carried in her blood. If this story is moving you, give it a like, and tell us in the comments if you've ever had to rediscover who you really are. During the 5 minutes the presentation lasted, no one in the ballroom moved. Some of America's most powerful businessmen had tears in their eyes. Women who had come simply to display their dresses and jewelry found themselves confronting their own hidden truths. But for Alexander, the experience was devastating on a completely different level. As he watched Isabella move with a passion that seemed to spring directly from her soul, he realized that for 3 years he had been completely blind. He had not only ignored her hidden physical beauty, he had despised her intelligence, minimized her value, treated as insignificant a woman who was extraordinary in every possible sense. When the music ended, and silence took over the ballroom, Isabella remained motionless in the center of the stage, breathing deeply. Then, as if awakening from a trance, she looked directly toward the table where Alexander was seated. The ovation that followed was deafening. The entire audience stood up, applauding with an intensity that made the champagne glasses on the tables tremble. But Isabella only had eyes for one person. She walked toward Alexander's table with the same grace with which she had danced, but now there was something different in her posture. She was no longer the woman who had transformed herself to impress others. She was simply herself, complete and without apologies. "Mr. Blackwood," she said when she reached his side, using the formal title but with a smile that contained all the intimacy in the world. "I think I no longer need to hide from you." Alexander stood up slowly, conscious that every person in the ballroom was observing his reaction, but for the first time in his adult life, he didn't care what others thought. "Isabella," he said her full name for the first time, savoring each syllable. "I have no words." "Then listen," she responded. "For 3 years you treated me as if I were invisible. You made me feel small, insignificant, worthless. And I allowed it because I was hiding who I really was." The ballroom had fallen silent again. Patrick Morrison had approached and was listening to the conversation with obvious interest. "But tonight," continued Isabella, "I've remembered something my mother used to tell me. Midja, never let anyone make you feel you're less than what you are. You're the daughter of a woman who conquered the world with her art. That blood runs through your veins." Alexander felt the ground moving beneath his feet. The cruelty of his original plan hit him with full force. He had tried to humiliate her, use her as an object of mockery, and instead she had demonstrated a dignity and strength that shamed him deeply. "Isabella," he began, but she raised a hand to stop him. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not finished yet." She turned toward Patrick, who had been waiting patiently for the confrontation to end. "Mr. Morrison," she said with a smile that radiated confidence, "earlier you asked about my work. The truth is I have an MBA in international business from Columbia. I speak 6 languages fluently, and for the past 3 years I've been developing strategies that have increased Blackwood Industries' efficiency by 30%, strategies my boss never knew came from me." Patrick smiled broadly. "Miss Sinclair, would you be interested in a meeting next week? I'm looking for a partner to expand my operations into Latin America, and I think you might be exactly what I need." "I'd love to," responded Isabella without hesitation. Alexander watched the scene with a mixture of panic and admiration. In the space of one night, the woman he had considered expendable had become the center of attention at the most important business event of the year, and now he was about to lose her forever. "Isabella, wait," he said when she began to walk away with Patrick. "Please." She stopped and turned toward him, and Alexander saw something in her eyes he had never seen before. Compassion. Not pity. Not resentment. But a deep understanding of human nature that humbled him completely. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood. I want to apologize," he said, and the words came out more difficult than he had imagined. "My behavior toward you has been inexcusable, not just tonight, but during all these years." "Why did you really invite me tonight?" asked Isabella, and though her voice was soft, there was a firmness in it that demanded complete honesty. Alexander looked around the ballroom, conscious that dozens of people were listening to every word. He could have lied, could have invented an elegant excuse, but looking into Isabella's eyes, he realized she deserved the truth, no matter how shameful it was. "I wanted to humiliate you," he admitted, and the words fell into the silence like stones in a calm lake. "I thought it would be fun to bring the most common woman I knew to the most exclusive event of the year. I wanted people to laugh, to wonder what you were doing with me." A murmur of shock ran through the nearby tables. Several guests exchanged disgusted looks. "I see," said Isabella after a moment. "At least you're honest." "But I was wrong," continued Alexander desperately, "completely unforgivably wrong. You are the most extraordinary woman I've ever met, and I've been too blind and arrogant to see it." "And now that you see me?" asked Isabella. "Now that everyone sees me, what do you expect me to do with that information?" Alexander realized he had reached the most important moment of his life. He could continue being the man he had always been, proud, manipulative, emotionally distant, or he could risk everything for a chance at redemption he probably didn't deserve. "I hope you'll give me the opportunity to know the real woman," he said. "Not as your boss, not as someone who has power over you, but as a man who just realized he's been looking for something extraordinary in all the wrong places." "And why should I do that?" asked Isabella. "Why should I risk my newfound freedom for someone who treated me so badly?" The question hung in the air between them like a sword. Alexander knew he didn't have an answer that could completely satisfy her. He had no guarantees to offer, no proof that he had really changed. "Because," he said finally, with a vulnerability he had never shown anyone, "because for the first time in my life, I'm in love. Not with an idea, not with a fantasy, not with what someone can do for me. I'm in love with who you really are, Isabella Rose Sinclair, and I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I'm asking for a chance to prove I can be the man you deserve." The silence that followed seemed eternal. Isabella studied him with those deep eyes that now knew their true value. Finally, a small but genuine smile appeared on her lips. "One chance," she said. "Just one. But not as my boss. If this is going to work, I quit my job tomorrow morning, and you'll have to court me, like any other man would court any other woman. Without power, without money as bait, with nothing more than who you really are." "I accept," said Alexander, immediately. "Any condition you set." "Then," said Isabella, extending her hand toward him, "perhaps you can start by asking me to dance, as equals this time." Alexander took her hand, and for the first time felt the real electricity of her touch. It wasn't the functional contact of an assistant passing documents. It was the connection between two people who finally saw each other clearly. As they headed toward the dance floor, Patrick Morrison approached them with an amused smile. "Miss Sinclair," he said, "my offer still stands, but take the time you need to resolve other matters." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," responded Isabella. "I'll be in touch." On the dance floor, under the golden lights of the grand ballroom, Alexander and Isabella began to move together for the first time as equals. He discovered that she danced with the same natural grace she had shown on stage, but now there was an intimacy in their movements that made him dizzy. "Do you really speak 6 languages?" he asked, as they turned to the rhythm of the classical music. "7, actually," responded Isabella, with a mischievous smile. "I forgot to mention Mandarin. And the MBA, summa cum laude. I did it at night, and on weekends while working for you." Alexander shook his head, amazed. "How is it possible I didn't notice?" "Because you never bothered to really look," said Isabella, but without bitterness. "For 3 years, you saw what you expected to see, an ordinary assistant. It never occurred to you that there might be more. Will you ever forgive me?" he asked, spinning her gently. "I already am," responded Isabella. "But forgiveness and trust are different things. Trust has to be earned." As they continued dancing, Alexander realized that the night had been a revelation in more than one sense. He had not only discovered the extraordinary woman he had been ignoring for years, he had confronted the ugliest parts of his own personality, and had made the decision to change. It wouldn't be easy. 32 years of arrogance and privilege couldn't be erased overnight. But looking into Isabella's eyes, seeing the mixture of challenge and hope that shone in them, he felt something he had never experienced before. Genuine motivation to become a better version of himself. When the music ended, They remained together in the center of the floor, conscious that the gazes of the entire ballroom remained fixed on them. But for the first time in their lives, neither of them cared what others thought. "What happens now?" asked Alexander. "Now," said Isabella, "you take me home. And tomorrow, if you want to court me properly, you can start by calling to invite me to dinner. But you'll have to impress me with something more than money or power." "Like what?" "Surprise me," responded Isabella, with a smile that promised adventures he had never imagined. As they left the Plaza Hotel, the photographers again fired their cameras frantically. But this time, Alexander realized that the photos would tell a completely different story from the one he had planned. It wouldn't be the story of a powerful man humiliating a vulnerable woman. It would be the story of an extraordinary woman who had found the courage to reclaim her place in the world, and of a man who had been lucky enough to be present when it happened. In the Aston Martin, as they drove back to Greenwich Village, Isabella broke the contemplative silence that had filled the car. "May I ask you something, Mr. Blackwood?" "Alexander," he corrected. "And please, ask whatever you want. What made you so cruel? What turned you into someone who finds pleasure in humiliating others?" The question hit him like a punch to the stomach. It was direct, unadorned, and demanded an honesty he had rarely allowed himself. "Fear," he admitted after a long moment. "Fear of not being enough on my own. My father built an empire, my grandfather before him. I always felt I had to prove I was worthy of that legacy, and the easiest way to feel superior was to make others feel inferior. Now I realize that true strength doesn't come from making others feel small," said Alexander. "It comes from finding someone who makes you want to be better than you are." When they stopped in front of Isabella's building, she didn't immediately get out of the car. Instead, she turned toward him with a thoughtful expression. "Alexander," she said, and the sound of his name on her lips made him shiver. "What happened tonight changes everything. Not just between us, but for me. I can't go back to being the invisible woman I was before. I wouldn't want you to," he responded sincerely. "Good," said Isabella, opening the car door. "Because the woman you met tonight is who I really am, and that woman doesn't accept less than what she deserves." As she headed toward the building entrance, Alexander rolled down the window. "Isabella," he called. She stopped and turned toward him. "Tomorrow night," he said, "may I invite you to dinner?" "You can try," she responded with a smile that was part challenge, part promise. "But remember, you're no longer dealing with your assistant. You're dealing with Isabella Rose Sinclair, daughter of Mercedes Sinclair, businesswoman, and someone who finally knows what she's worth." As he watched her figure disappear into the building's entrance, Alexander leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. The night had begun as a cruel game designed to feed his ego, and had ended with the complete collapse of everything he thought he knew about power, beauty, and true value. For the first time in his life, he would have to win a woman without the advantages of power or position. He would have to prove he deserved her attention, her respect, and eventually, if he was lucky, her love. It was terrifying and exciting at the same time. As he drove back to his penthouse on the Upper East Side, Alexander began planning not a business strategy, but something much more important: how to become the man Isabella Rose Sinclair deserved. The transformation that night had been just the beginning for both of them. And as the lights of Manhattan twinkled around him like terrestrial stars, Alexander smiled for the first time in years, with a happiness that had nothing to do with power, money, or control. It had everything to do with the possibility of real love. If you made it this far, subscribe for more stories that touch your heart. Did you like this transformation? Do you think Alexander can really change? Tell us your opinion in the comments.